And what I'd like to tell you about today is how Save the Elephants is working to give a voice to elephants and to advance the adoption of science-driven solutions to coexistence on a much wider scale. This is a story, as Esther said, about our relationship with nature. Africa is home to one of the last great surviving stores of biodiversity on the planet. And elephants are absolutely vital to these ecosystems that store this biodiversity. To the cultures and communities that exist across Africa, elephants often represent far more than just their species. They tend to represent nature as a whole. They're ambassadors for the wild, and how people feel about elephants often shapes the future of not just elephants, but of other wildlife as well. So Save the Elephants was founded, of course, by Ian Douglas Hamilton, and lovely to hear Peter's statement of Ian founding conservation in northern Kenya. He was the first zoologist to study elephants in the wild and became, in many ways, a godfather of elephant conservation and was a voice for elephants over the next 6 decades. He helped to lead the world through 2 major ivory crises and founded Save the Elephants along the way. And in 2018, much to our joy, the Chinese government decided to close down the ivory trade in their borders, and we've seen ivory poaching reduce to a great extent across the continent as a result. Ian's superpower in these battles was data, and Save the Elephants remains firmly established on these principles of using science and data to secure a future for elephants. Today, a new challenge has emerged, and that challenge is how people and elephants can coexist on an increasingly crowded continent. In 1979, there were about 1.3 million elephants living in over more than 7 million square kilometers of habitat. Over the next 10 years, that halved as a result. That number of elephants halved due to the ivory trade. The elephant populations have never really recovered from the horrors of the ivory trade, but the human population, meanwhile, has mushroomed, and Africa now has the highest population growth of any continent on the planet. Today, elephants live in less than half of their previous range, their 1979 range, and as that habitat has shrunk, competition for the resources that are needed, both by elephants and people, has increased. And this has led to the conflict we see today. But it's not just elephants who are suffering. Elephants are being speared, shot, snared sometimes, but it's also humans. Rural Africa has some of the poorest people on the planet, and they're planting crops for their families, and they're losing those crops to elephants, and their people are being injured and killed as a result. And along the way, biodiversity suffers as well. Because, as I said, elephants have come to represent nature in general. They're the face of conflict. And if people's faith in wildlife erodes, they trust national parks less, they respect national parks less, and they're less willing to give up the land that might be needed to connect national parks. Thankfully, we know that coexistence is possible. There are some basic steps we can create to put in place coexistence. Firstly, the more you can plan landscapes, as those of you who are here this morning heard, landscape planning is key. That helps us avoid the fragmentation and the fracturing that ends up fomenting conflict. The second is to set aside core habitats for wildlife and elephants and protect the corridors that link them. That's easier said than done because Africa is changing fast. There are roads and railways cutting across the more developing countries now, often funded by the China Belt and Road Initiative and other government funders. But what we've seen is that if we work with governments and communities, giving elephants a voice through tracking data. We can work with the developers to put in place the crossing points that are needed to prevent the worst impacts of this infrastructure. Lastly, in mixed landscapes on the boundaries where people and elephants are forced to live close together, you need sustainable barriers to keep them apart. So this formula for coexistence works, and we've seen it work across the continent. We've got lots of mitigation solutions that different organizations have come up with, the beehive fence that Esther mentioned, but there are myriad other organizations that have cooked up solutions of their own for their particular environments. The challenge is that these solutions are often siloed in different places, and neighboring communities, let alone countries, are often unaware of solutions that are working elsewhere. The challenge also is the scale of Africa. You could fit the USA, China, India, Europe, and Japan into Africa and still have space to spare. So how can we take on and have an impact as a small local NGO at such a scale? Well, the solution is a continental coexistence network. That's what we need. And thankfully, in 2013, Save the Elephants teamed up with the Wildlife Conservation Network to create the Elephant Crisis Fund. And 10 years, 450 grants later, we've got 150 of the best, deeply embedded, locally connected, effective groups across the continent. There are other networks, like the Earth Ranger Network, which is a software to allow the management of protected areas that Save the Elephants helped to seed. That's now in 500 different protected areas, not just in Africa, but around the world. These are also seeds from which coexistence can grow. So what we're now concentrating on at SDE is powering up this network with research and then sharing the knowledge that we've assembled from our own research and from other partners, and then funding the adoption of these solutions by scaling our partner network. Just to dive quickly into each of these buckets, researching elephants is key. We have to understand elephants as best as we possibly can. The movements of elephants across landscapes tells us what they need through tracking, but also the fundamentals of cognition. We, earlier this year, released a study that showed, for the first time in a non-human animal, that elephants use names for one another. We don't know what this is going to lead to in terms of applications, but then we didn't know what investigating whether it was true that elephants were scared of bees would lead to either. To enable this research, we do try and create often cutting-edge technologies around tracking traditionally, but today we're doing some really interesting stuff with around the interface of drones and AI that has great potential in a number of different areas. And we carry this all the way through to developing solutions such as the beehive fence. But even the beehive fence might have remained a niche PhD program under Lucy King had she not shared it so effectively across networks. And this is our second bucket. How do we share this understanding as best as possible? And we've done a good job with the beehive fence, now protecting hundreds of farms across 23 different countries. It's not the only solution. We've now got more than 80 solutions to help people live with elephants that we've collected from across this network that we're redistributing. There's the Trainer of Trainers program that Esther was talking about that is being highly effective, but we need to do more. We're developing courses for wildlife departments in different countries, and last month we launched a WhatsApp bot trained on the toolbox, trained on an AI in the toolbox that is giving advice for free to anyone that calls the number. We're also helping people that live alongside elephants to appreciate elephants outside of a kind of scary conflict situation they might usually find themselves in. So nothing is more magical than taking school kids who live in the elephant range into a national park for the first time and allowing them to meet elephants from the safety of a vehicle. But so too is it wonderful to join the 130,000 people so far in rural Kenya that have enjoyed some of the world's finest natural history filmmaking with our Elephant Queen mobile cinema These are people that live far from electricity, far from televisions. They never get to see the films that you and I do. It's a wonderful experience to do that with them. And finally, we support the grantee network to deploy these tools through grants and training and support. We need to secure the key habitats. We need the core areas of elephant populations in unstable areas, but also small elephant populations, the remnants of the ivory, survivors from the ivory trade, and how we can help those populations to recover and re-expand across what can sometimes be large remaining habitats. And we must always guard against the threat of a resurgent ivory trade. So the model works. In the communities where we've been able to apply it, we've seen mortalities and injuries from conflict reduce on both the human and the elephant side of the equation. We've seen crop damage reduce. We've seen income from alternative livelihoods increase from cash crops rather than people growing crops that elephants like to eat. And as a result, the most important thing is that we see attitudes to elephants transform from negative to positive. So we've got a big vision for how we can roll this out and the impact that we can have across the landscape, because together, with your partnership, we can help more people live in harmony with elephants, coexist peacefully with elephants, along the way protecting the vital biodiversity and climate resilience that we need so much. So thank you for being here and for helping to create a wonderful future.